All right, so I want to welcome you guys, everyone, to our afternoon webinar here. My name is Mindy Murdoch. I'm Director of Recreation Services for Zionsville Parks and Recreation. And today's topic is choosing native plants for your landscape. In the past, maybe you have sat in either in live programs with me or some of our other webinar or Facebook Live programs. I am a naturalist by trade, over 20 years of experience, but I am personally an avid gardener, especially when it comes to vegetable gardening and native plants for your backyard. So just kind of thinking about when I first got started in the realm of native plants and, trying to figure out what would be the best for my yard. That was kind of the catalyst for doing this presentation. This by no means is a end all be all of these are the only plants that you can pick. So we will go through some plants on here, but I tried to pick ones that I know are very easy for most people to find. And we can talk a little bit about where do you look for plants towards the end, but also plants that are easy enough to grow in your own yard. And then also, for the most part, behave very well. There are some natives that, they can never be considered invasive if it's a native species, because to be an invasive, one of those components is that you're not native to the area. But there are natives that are like I said, the nice way of putting them is they're a little bit of a bully when they get into habitats, whether it's a native habitat or in your backyard habitat. And I think if you start playing around with a lot of the bully species, if it's you're not really know what's going on, it can kind of turn you off and make you frustrated. So when we talk about some of the plants, I tried to pick ones that I know aren't really gonna get too crazy, so that if you're just starting out, you're not, tearing out your hair and scorning everyone that's talked about native plants ever. So, but let's get started. Come on. There we go. It always has a lull right when we start. So to talk about native plants in our backyard, well, the first thing we need to talk about is, why native plants? Why can't I just go to the regular garden center and just pick out anything that looks pretty, because that's what we've always done in the past, and plant it in my yard, or have a landscape company just put whatever in my yard, just because, flowers are pretty and trees are green and bushes provide some privacy, and then we're all happy and we've got our green yards. Well, there's a few reasons why we want to really kind of start focusing back onto our natives. One is, a native plant is something that over thousands of years, they've naturally grown and adapted to each region's unique conditions. So if you're tuning in and you're in central Indiana, we have our own group of native plants. If you happen to be watching this from the West Coast or East Coast or South, you're going to have your own unique plants that have adapted over time to the environmental conditions that your area provides to you. So, they're sustainable. They can thrive in our local soil. They can survive in our weather conditions. So we don't really need to provide a lot of fertilizers. Actually, they do best without you really babying them too much. And you also don't need to worry too often about things like late freezes or, early frosts and things like that, where you might have to for some of your more ornamental species. The other thing is, as you landscape with native plants, you're actually restoring healthy natural habitat back into your community. So the picture here kind of shows on the one side, just that traditional grass lawn, and on the other side, where those homes have started to kind of naturalize their setting. And that's providing a lot of habitat that, otherwise would not be there, that it's been lost to sprawl and to growth. Many natives are very deep rooted. So that's another thing to keep in mind. When you're planning your garden, is proper planning is important, because some of those really deep-rooted natives, you're not going to be able to easily relocate them if you decide, hey, this plant is too tall for what I thought it was going to be. But those deep roots are important because one, they're going to help reduce erosion. Second, they're going to really slow down any kind of storm water. So by storm water, we mean if we have a really heavy rain event and you get 2 inches, which isn't uncommon or more, those deep roots are going to, and the plants are going to help slow that water and take more of that water in than you would from grass, which really only has roots a few inches below the soil. And that's going to overall help the water quality within your area. So your creeks, your ponds, if you live in an HOA, a lot of times, like right now when the weather starts to warm, you're going to see those big algal blooms because of all the fertilizer from the lawns. And there's no way to slow it down, and it goes straight into the pond, and then algae grows. So having those natives, even a buffer around the pond, is going to help provide better water quality for even your HOA ponds. And if you're interested in that, we do have on the Zionsville Parks and Recreation YouTube, we have a webinar that we did last year on native environments in HOAs. So, and then like I said, natives, you know, they're adapted to the area, so they really don't need no extra fertilizers. Once they're established, they don't need extra watering because they can handle those drought type conditions. So really that's going to save on your water consumption because about 30% of our water in the United States goes to, you know, our lawns, to keep our lawns green when they really shouldn't be green in the middle of the summer droughts. It also reduces the need for use of pesticides because, again, they've adapted to a lot of those native insects and actually help provide habitat and food for native predators that will help keep those pests in check. And many of them, if you have this issue, many of them are deer resistant. You can focus on ones that are deer resistant if you happen to have a lot of browsing in your yard. So some other native benefits, and this really gets into, you know, why a lot of us look towards native is because we want to start attracting wildlife back into. We want to kind of be that, you know, that backyard oasis. So, you know, our native plants are our foundation for all of the native wildlife species, whether it's other plants, whether it's insects, whether it's birds. You can't have birds if you don't have insects because birds need insects to feed their young. So those native plants are going to provide really quality food for insects, which in turn feed the birds. They're also going to provide quality berries for birds and seeds and nuts for animals that would eat that. Whereas a lot of our ornamentals, the quality of food is less, or in the case of insects, a lot of them won't even eat them. So we always say if nothing is nibbling on your garden, then you actually have a problem. So you actually want to see some insect nibbling going on your plants. Of course, having those natives, you're going to invite butterflies and other pollinators like bees into your yard. And then those plants are going to provide different types of nesting shelters and sites, anywhere from areas where animals can nest kind of in at the base because it's very lush, or even a lot of these natives, when they die back in the winter, their stems are hollow. And so that makes a great habitat for a lot of our native bees, that they will nest in those hollow stems. So you always will hear that, you know, don't be real quick at the beginning of spring to clean up your yard because you want to make sure it's been warm enough that those insects have a chance to wake up before you bag and remove that debris. And then we've got to talk. Now, I am not going to say that, you know, lawns are evil, get rid of all of them. Some people will go that far. Lawns do have their role to play, especially if you have young kids or sports. But the amount of lawn that we have here in the United States is a little bit of an obsession. So just a little quick thing on the American lawn, because we can't talk natives if we don't talk about the other side of that, which is our lawns, because they're completely opposite of what a native plant needs versus what we throw into our lawn. So here in the United States, the lawn is the most grown crop in the entire United States. That's, you think about all the different crops out there: corn, soybeans, wheat, alfalfa. Lawns are the #1 grown crop out of any of them, and we can't eat our lawn. So about 63,000 square miles of America is covered in lawn, and that's about the size of Texas, to give you an idea. And really, the volume of resources that we throw into our lawns, it's staggering. I mean, lawns are, here in America, they're a status symbol, right? When you're looking at your neighbors, you're going to look at that neighbor that has put so much time and effort into their lawn, and they got the company that comes out and they fertilize it 8 times a year, and there's not a single dandelion in that entire property. It's cut to perfection every week. They've got a lot of money, right? So it's kind of a status symbol, whereas maybe the other neighbor that it's covered in weeds, and you're sitting there thinking, wow, they just really don't care about their property. So, but lawns here in the United States require the equivalent of 200 gallons of drinking water per person per day. So if we're talking about times when there is drought issues or states that have water issues, lawns are just kind of a little silly to really try to focus to that. And then you add in that, this significant amount of really that lawn care. It's a huge industry that we've built, everywhere from chemicals to seeds that we throw into this plant that, other than rolling around in it, there's not much else we can do. So, while green space is very important for really everybody in the United States, and that's one of the big things that we hear here in the parks over and over again, is people want to see more green space. There is that movement to turn away from, when we think of green space, we think of a big rolling, grassy field, to more of a natural lifestyle. And so that's why we're having this discussion. So again, not against the lawn. There's really easy and good ways to be very conservation minded and still have some of your lawn. So I'm not saying go in there and tear out all of your lawn. So, but what I do want you to do is, whether you've been doing native gardening or this is, you're really just getting started out and you're like, why am I doing this? How do I get started? It's really, what's your garden's purpose? Ask yourself that question. What do you want to see out of your backyard, out of your garden? What purpose do you want it to serve? Why are you doing natives? Do you want to have where you're specifically trying to attract certain pollinators? I know the big push is for monarchs, but there's so many other pollinators out there that need our help. And there's more research that actually some of the things we're doing for the monarch are actually not beneficial to that insect. Do you want to create a landscape that it is low maintenance? So you're not putting all that time and effort into it like you do if all you had was lawn, because you don't need to mow the native plants, and you don't need to worry about spraying them for Japanese beetles and things of that sort, because they're not going to have the same pests as some ornamentals. Are you really focused on, you want everything to be very tidy? So that's going to give you an idea of certain plants that you're going to want to pick and others you're probably going to stick away from. Are you trying to add in some privacy? Do you have areas in your yard that get very wet and you're tired of trying to make grass grow? Or the other gamut on that one, are you trying to create a rain garden? So if an area is already wet, we don't want to make that a rain garden. We'll put plants that can take the wet. But if you have a very nice drainable area and you want to create a rain garden, there's plants that you can use for that one as well. We're not getting into rain gardens. There's a lot of fantastic YouTubes that have been created by soil and water conservation districts on that topic. So think about it. What's your purpose for your garden? Do you want to just have pretty flowers? That's fine. So the second thing that you want to do then, after you figure out what your purpose is that you want to create your plan for your garden, and not that you want to stick every single plant that you want here, but it's really more of a plan of, if you're going to be putting in plants, which plants should you focus on? And what you can do, and that's kind of like with this picture, is you can go, and if you own your home, you probably had a survey done, and you probably have something similar to this, or you can go onto a GIS through your county, and you can probably download your survey that shows kind of your outline of your home, you know, where your residence is, if you have a deck, where's your driveway, and then use that to kind of do like here, where you map out, you kind of watch what's going on in your yard and you map out your conditions, because that's really going to help you decide what type of plants to put in those areas. And so studying your site, those conditions you're going to focus on are going to be things like, what type of soil do you have, the hydrology of that area, how much sun or shade an area will get. So you kind of map out your space. And then of course you want to mark plants that are already existing that you don't want to get rid of, right? If you've got a nice large maple tree in your yard, just because you want to start back over, you know, keep the tree. Just mark it on your plan that you have a tree, because even though you know, it might be in the front yard and the front yard's always shady, that maple tree underneath it is going to change that. It's going to change the hydrology because it's going to be a lot drier, and it's going to provide more shade. So there's going to be different plants that would grow under that maple tree than they might somewhere else just a few feet away. So the other thing is, you know, we all do this, right? Research things that you love, particular plants or colors. Drive around your neighborhood, do a Pinterest search, see some things that might attract you. And when you're starting to plan, start to think about, especially for natives, the mature height that they're going to get and size, and keep that in mind, because again, they're not always the easiest to relocate. So if you're trying to put something in front of your window and you know, the plant itself gets 6 or 7 feet tall, it's probably not the best spot to put it. So kind of do some research on some of the heights for those. And then if we're trying to attract wildlife, the big one is design for not just year-round color, but year-round food sources. So a lot of ours are pollinators, they're going to want the flowers, but just also what else might be eating those plants that you're providing for that kind of year-round continuous too. So you're providing that native habitat. So we'll go a little bit more into what we're talking about, conditions. So when we talk about soil type, there's really 3 kinds. There's clay, which, you know, is kind of like the picture here. It's going to be really small and tightly packed particles. Clay does have a lot of nutrients in it. The problem with clay is that it absorbs water slowly. So that means you get a lot of puddling in your yard, and it holds that water for a long time. So it can hold a lot of moisture and can make it very wet. The other downside of that one is that when finally those clay soils dry out, they get extremely hard and they crack. So on the other end of that are your loam soils. And so this is kind of this is what everybody wants to have, right? Where it's kind of an equal part, it drains properly, and you can get that. But the nice thing to say is that you don't need to plan on trying to get loam soil if you want native plants. You can pick native plants that would do perfectly fine in good old clay soil. They've adapted to clay soil. If they're native to here in central Indiana, we have clay soils. And if they're native to central Indiana, they can handle the clay. The other one would be sandy soil. So if you're trying to get a plant that prefers sandy soil, then you're going to have to change some things up, because sandy soils are really aerated. They drain very fast, and there's specific plants that kind of have evolved to grow in that type of soil. So if there's a plant you truly love and it's a sand loving plant, you're going to have to make some adjustments on that end. And then you get into soil moisture, right? So, and I've kind of broke up when we talk about the plants into medium soils, and then kind of a moist to a little bit more on the wet side of a soil. So the picture here is you know, some good old moist wet soil, where, you know, there's going to be sections of it that might stay damp or at least have water. right below the surface, that it's moist year round. So even in the middle of a dry spell in August, you could dig down a couple inches, you'd still find wet soil. Means you're flooded in the spring and in the fall. And if you get a real heavy summer storm, you might have some standing water for a couple days. So these are places that you don't want to put a rain garden because they're not going to drain out that water. Medium soils means that they can regularly get damp. They might have some standing water after really heavy rain, but they're going to dry back out. And usually by summer, they're often very, very dry, right? You're going to dig down pretty far before you start to come across any kind of moisture. So again, if you're not experiencing areas where it has a lot of standing water after during the spring and fall, it's probably in the medium range. And then dry soils are going to be those that are either going to be a very sandy type soil or gravel or rock. So not that, you know, if you're basing off of, you know, it's August and it hasn't rained for 4 weeks, doesn't mean that you have dry soil. It just means you're in a drought. So, and then our sun exposure. So again, there's kind of those 3 levels that you can go with. So full sun means that at least for 6 hours of the day, those plants would get full on direct sun. A lot of your prairie, well, actually all of your prairie loving natives, they evolved to handle that full on strong sun. So in the middle of August, they can handle that blazing heat. They've got ways to handle that heat that are unique to each of them. Partial sun or partial shade, you know, depending on, you know, what catalogs or websites you're looking at, they kind of are used interchangeably, but it's really areas that are going to get less than 6, about 4 to 6 hours of sunlight. A lot of times that this sunlight is going to be, you know, it might be for the morning part of the day or the ending part of the day where most of that is, but think about plants that kind of evolved in a forest setting because those trees are going to provide a lot of shade. So your partial sun and shade a lot of time are your what we call the spring ephemerals, right? Those early spring wildflowers that should be starting up here. They haven't yet in your area. And they're short-lived. Sometimes their leaves stay around, but the flowers themselves are short-lived right early in the spring. And then shade means that those plants really, they prefer little direct sunlight. So if you put a shade-loving plant in the middle of a full-on sun, it's going to wither away pretty quickly. They usually prefer either very early morning sun or very evening, late afternoon sun, where it's not as scalding. So your woodland species, these are plants that would do great under, again, that maple, that dappled shade of a maple tree. So. And the neat thing with natives is that when we get into them, you know, when we start to try and break them out here, is that they can adapt to those. So there are natives that they can adapt to having wet to moist to even just medium type soil. There are natives that can go from full sun to part shade or shade to part shade. So there's that nice one. So when we get into the list, just because if I marked him at shade doesn't mean that's the only thing they can hit. It would get confusing if I tried to give you all of those. And there's websites that give you all of that detail. The other thing that you can think about is when we're talking about choosing our natives is there's a variation. You'll see ones where they focus on your planting zone, which maybe a lot of us are familiar with if we do vegetable gardening, versus the native range. So what's the difference? Well, planting zone is what the USDA has put together for kind of a hardness zone. It's usually what they do for non-native species, right? They'll say this plant is really good in zones 5, 6, 7B kind of thing. So that's what a hardiness zone means. It goes off of the temperatures you get in winter and your frosts. So, you know, here in Indiana, we have kind of a 5 and 6, depending on where you are in the state. So that's good if you're thinking about, you know, your tomato plants, or if you want to plant an azalea. It can help with natives, but if you truly want to stick to what would be found within your state, then they'll really want to look at the native range. So these are, the ranges of plants that are indigenous to your area. And BONAP, so Biota of North America program, is something you can find online, and you can search up for every single species that you ever want. There are even some, native plant nurseries that will actually include the BONAP in their information on each of their species, so you can check and see, is it naturally occurring in my state or in the portion of my state, because here in Indiana, there are some natives that you only find in the north or some that you can only find in the south. So if you are really want to truly stick to your species, kind of keep that in mind, that, you probably don't want to plant a southern Indiana plant up north if it's not really supposed to be found there. Some people don't really care. And then finally, we'll get into, proper prep and maintenance for your beds. One thing I highly stress, unless you're doing acres and acres of planting and you're using seed more than just plants themselves, you don't really want to use a lot of chemicals, because they're going to kind of go the detriment of hurting some of the wildlife. So, pull weeds by hand throughout the year. That's going to really help your plants as they get established. Sheet mulching is a great way to prep beds, where you use paper or cardboard, because that will naturally break down and actually add more nutrients into your soil. And you don't even have to dig up the yard. You just sheet mulch over top of the grass, and the grass will die and add organic matter. And of course, I will stress the leaves. We do not need to go out and rake up all our leaves and throw them into bags and throw them into the landfill. Because that's organic matter that can feed your plants. It's free organic matter, and it actually can provide nice natural mulch material. So about 18% of all of our solid municipal waste that ends up in a landfill is things that could have been left on site, such as yard clippings, raked leaves, branches, dead plants. Of course, if it's a diseased plant, you don't want to keep it around. But there's a lot that you can do and really minimize your impact to your community. And then finally, I threw this one in here, and depending on who you are, some native plant gardeners would love this garden. Others would say, wow, that looks like it needs mowed. So the one thing I can stress, especially depending on where you live, is really do focus, especially those areas that your neighbors are going to see. Especially if you live in an HOA, focus on keeping things tidy. You can be a native gardener and have native plants and have nothing but natives if you want, and still keep within those regulations that your HOA has, or keep your neighbors happy. So, and a great way to win approval of your neighbors and get them interested and asking questions and considering adding natives to their yard is to show them how beautiful they truly can be. So, think about using borders as you're designing your garden, a nice mowed edge, a hedge, stonework, things of that sort. Use curved lines. Group your plants instead of just throwing seed out and hoping it grows wherever it might. Actually be intentional in your planting. So you have groups of 3 to 5 for good impact. And the other thing I can stress is, as you're building out your plan, is start small, right? Start with one bed and just expand gradually. It's going to kind of imitate that succession, but it's also going to help get your neighbors interested in the idea of watching that bed kind of grow from one planting to another, to another, and kind of get them asking. And it's also a little easier for your HOA, if you do have one, to kind of stomach that transition, instead of just killing your entire yard and just seeding it over with natives. And then humanize your landscape. There's no reason why you couldn't add a gazing ball or a statue or a bird bath, and make it something that's pleasing to you as well as to people walking by. And then finally, and this one is a strong one and a hard one to do, respect your neighbor's right to their turf. If like the in the picture, the house next to them, if all they want is green lawn, you need to be respectful of that, because if they're respectful of you, you have to be respectful of their choices. And maybe with just being respectful and talking and discussion, you might be able to win them out. They might find a plant that you're growing that they really love and they want to add it to their yard. And then you've made a win. So always be respectful. And so here's some examples of really how you can be very intentional in your native plantings and make it something very beautiful. All right, so we're going to go quickly over some different plants. And again, these are the no end all be all. They're just ones that, in my time of gardening that I know you can easily find, that also do very well. And, really, hopefully wouldn't give you a lot of grief later if you planted them. So we kind of broke them up into medium soils and then kind of more of the wetter soil, depending on your types. And then also broke them up by, the amount of sun that they need. And again, just a few from each to pick from. There are hundreds and hundreds of native plants, and there's no way we could list them all in our short time that we have here. So if you're looking for plants for full-on sun, a few that are very attractive and easy to grow and do very well. One is, and it's actually a native onion, it's called the nodding onion. Great for pollinators as well, and very pretty. Not just the onions that come up. These are also, if you have issues with deer or rabbits, this is a great one to kind of put in portions of your garden to kind of deter them. Butterfly weed, we all know, which is one of the milkweeds. So you'll see in some of these, I might have, like for butterfly weed, I have 2 feet. So most of them, if I didn't mark their growth height, is kind of under 4 feet or under. There's a few I marked that are very short, just because I don't think people realize how short they might be. And then anything over 4 foot, I tried to put a mark there, just because those are usually where you run into trouble, right? You really like a plant and you don't realize that it gets 6 foot tall. So it's kind of an idea. But our butterfly weed is one of our native milkweeds. But unlike most of our milkweeds that get in the 3 to 4 foot range, butterfly weed stays very short. So it's got pretty orange flowers and about 2 foot in size. So it's a short, beautiful little flower that you can grow. Coneflower, everybody knows. And then one of the blazing stars, so the prairie blazing star, because it's a little more short statured and very easy to come across, and does well in a lot of different soil and shade type. Continuing into sun, bergamot, the nice thing with really any of the mints, so mint does get a little aggressive when it's growing, but the mints, they far well make up for it. Just some of the amount of pollinators that they attract. So they have a very high benefit for wildlife, if you can handle that. They like to spread quite a little bit. So any of the mints, the wild bergamot, if you get into like the wood mints, they will spread a little bit, but the pollinators love them. Obedient plant is the plant there off to the side with the monarch on it. And then I would always stress within your garden, especially for some fall color and food, is look at a goldenrod. Goldenrods get really bad reps because people think that fall allergies are caused by goldenrod, and it's not. They're caused by ragweed. So goldenrod, its pollen does not cause allergies, but it's one of the highest valued plants in the fall for pollinators. So always think of trying to add a goldenrod somewhere into your yard, just for the benefit that it provides, and it gives you that beautiful gold color. So stiff goldenrod's a really nice one for full summer, and I have another one for when you get into more of a shade. And then we can't, not talk native plants if we don't talk about adding in some grasses, because grasses have a lot of benefits, especially for the insects that eat them and then provide food for the birds. And also, I know a lot of people like ornamental grasses. So there's some beautiful natives that you can put instead of getting some of those more ornamental type fountain grasses. You can go for the real big ones, such as big blue stem or Indian grass, or you can go with something a little bit smaller, like Prairie dropseed. That's the one that has the different mounds that are in that picture with the house, or you know, little blue stem. And so I actually have little blue stem growing in the front of my house, and it's, you know, it's beautiful because it turns out really pretty, kind of a reddish brown in the fall, and I leave it up until springtime and then cut it back. So much so that even my in-laws now are asking me for some little blue stem to add to their yard because they just thought it was so pretty. And we get into kind of a partial sun shade situation there. If you're looking for a ground cover, wild ginger is a great native ground cover. It gets about 6 inches in height, and you can see it has those kind of hoof-shaped leaves. The flowers are underneath, and they're really hard to see. They're kind of, people don't really realize they do make flowers, but it's a great native ground cover if you're looking for an area that's shade and you want to stay away from things like vinca or ivy. Bellwort is the white flower towards the bottom. Blue false indigo is the one that's above that, and it's actually, even though it's a you know, it's a normal plant, it's not a shrub, it gets to shrub size, and it's nice and full and erect. So if you want to be a little bit more tidy, indigo is a great one for that kind of that tidy aesthetic, that it semi looks like a shrub, but it dies completely back down. It has those beautiful purple flowers. Great blue lobelia is one of the lobelias that like shade. Cardinal flower, I know a lot of people also like. Cardinal flower can be a little tricky. Lobelia is little, you know, it can stand a lot of you know, hard love, and it does just fine. And then, you know, oops, sorry, Bellwort was the yellow one. I don't know why I said it was the white one. And penstemon is the white one. So there's a whole lot of different penstemons, native, and they're a great addition to your yard. And they can handle some shade, they can handle some sun. So just find the right one for you. Few more for your partial. Heart-leaved aster, so kind of like the goldenrods. If you have a location that you can put an aster, highly recommend it, again, for that fall food source for pollinators and that fall color. So heart-leaved is one that does well in the shade. There's others like Sky, New England, that do well in the sun. They get quite big though, and they can get a little leggy. Sweet Joe Pie, another great shade and another great pollinator one. This one does get tall though. There's some Joe Pies that get a little bit shorter. Blue stem goldenrod is one of the goldenrods for shade, and then wild geranium. So if you want, again, kind of your spring ephemeral, a little bit of pop of color, you can put that with some native ferns as well. And then those grasses or sedges. So sedges have edges. It's really the only difference. They're similar in growth, that do well in shade. Palm sedge and sea oats, both of these, some people don't like them because sedges have a tendency to grow and fill. But if you're in a lot of shade, sometimes you want that, where you want an area kind of filled up with something green other than just the dirt that you see, because your grass can't grow. Also with sea oats is it will have a tendency to kind of fill in an area, but has beautiful seed pods when it finally goes to seed. So, but if you're looking for a spot to kind of fill it up and hold some of that moisture and suck it up so you don't have a lot of wetness, sedges are a great way to go for that route. And then we'll get to some natives that like moist soils. So moist or wet. Now, if you're completely wet, then you're going to want to look for aquatic plants, and we're not getting into aquatic plants. So in areas that have full sun, you're going to look for things like, here's a milkweed that is a native, and that's the rose milkweed. It likes wet but full sun. And the nice thing with this one is even if you have just a downspout that drops water in your yard, you can plant rose milkweed. Some people call it swamp milkweed. I've seen, lots of different ones, but the incarnata is the one you want. That one does great right by your downspout. That's where mine are planted, and they do perfectly fine right in front of the downspout. And that's one in the bottom corner. Ironweed's another fall one. Ohio Spiderwort, or there's another Spiderwort you can buy as well. It's very similar, Prairie, I think. And it's almost like someone took a grass and a plant, put them together, a flower, and put it together. So it has very grassy like leaves and nonstop blooms throughout the summertime. Beautiful and very attractive to pollinators as well. Queen of the Prairie is the one that's down there towards the bottom, has those plumes of pink. And then a little shorter bit of a Joe Pye weed. So ironweed and Joe Pye are about 5 to 6 feet with regards to ones that can handle the moist soil. So they're still tall, but they're great for in the back of your planting bed. Maybe not so much in front of your window. And then getting into those grasses that can handle wet. And again, you're getting your sedges as well. Prairie cordgrass, sweet vanilla, or vanilla sweetgrass. It actually has that sweet scent to it. And then the burr sedge, it has those really fun little burr pods onto it. So if we're talking natives, as much as we love all the flowers, I would also ask you to think about adding some native shrubs, especially if you're removing some of the shrubs that you have or considering removing. So a lot of people turn to things like burning bush and a lot of the various different, rhododendrons and azaleas and hydrangea, because they're easy enough to find in the garden center. But there's natives that are just as beautiful, if not more beautiful, and they provide a benefit to native plants, to wildlife. So if you're looking for a screen, there's no reason that you have to get a line of burning bush when you can go the route of something like a black hall viburnum, or looking at a row of 9-barks. And 9-bark is one that you can easily find. If you want something a little larger, you can look at witch hazel, and they get those yellow flowers in the winter. If you want something that's kind of compact and small, but still great for pollinators, look at something like New Jersey tea. If you have a wet area, that bottom left there, that's buttonbush. So if you have an area that gets wet and has some shade to it, buttonbush is a great one, and pollinators love that plant. And so we keep talking about pollinators. So what do we mean if someone wants to just plant for pollinators? And I actually pulled some plants, and these aren't for butterflies. So when I think about pollinators, a lot of people throw butterflies in there, and butterflies do come to plants and they do pollinate, but not very well. Your true pollinators are going to be your native bees. So your bumblebees, your carpenter bees, the mason bees, those are going to be your native bees. And that's really what your focus should be. Not, butterflies will come. Really, if you want butterflies, you need to get host plants for butterflies. And we're going to be having a webinar in the summer on butterflies and their host plants. But if you really want to attract some good pollinators to your area, you want to focus on your natives and not the honeybees. Honeybees are great, but they're not native. And they actually can cause some problems for our natives, but looking at what can you do for the native bumblebee. And really for pollinators, it breaks down to 2 different things. They're coming to those flowers either to collect pollen, and they can use that pollen then to feed their young, or they're going to that plant to get nectar, and nectar provides them that quick fuel for them to keep going. And it varies throughout the season. So again, when you're planting, you want to look at what's going on in your season and trying to have something throughout the year. So not just focusing on summer flowers, but things in the spring and things in the fall. So if you really want to focus on some pollen that really helps them build up their young, so that you have some good bumblebees and other natives into the summer, is you want to look at things such as like bluebells or even a redbud are great for pollen. When you get into summer, the interesting thing is that spiderwort that I showed you, it really doesn't create any nectar. So the only thing that the pollinators are going for is pollen, and it creates a ton of pollen for them. The indigo Button bush is another one, and then wild senna, which is one of my favorite native plants. And that one, even though it's like 5 foot tall, it is in front of my window just because I love watching first thing in the morning, all the bumblebees just kind of flock to that plant just to get all the pollen that they can. In the fall, Joe Pye and Turtlehead are another really good pollen plant for pollinators. For your nectar, things like, and a lot of these we've already touched on, like the wild geranium, the bellwort, those golden alexanders are going to give a lot of pollen to, or nectar to your bees. In the summer, a lot of the ones that might attract butterflies as well are also going to be great for all those little native bees. Your butterfly weed, your penstemon, that New Jersey tea shrub, and then your mints. Your mints are high on nectar, nice sweet nectar that they're going to flock over. And then, like I said, it's important that you look into the fall because it's really going to give them what they need to overwinter. And so things like the asters, your blazing stars, your ironweed, are another really important nectar ones. You can also put in there goldenrod for both pollen and nectar as well for these native pollinators. And then my last closing, and then I'll open up if you have some questions, is this is another one that pops up when people start asking, is it important to plant a native plant? Or can I look at a nativar? So what is a nativar? Nativar is where they've taken native plants, because that's what the garden community likes to do, and they've cultivated to make varieties. And some of those varieties are actually beneficial to add in because it might help with disease resistance or add other features. And some are entirely for show. So it might be where they try to cultivate in like day glow yellowish foliage or double flower heads like you see there on that cone flower, or they might try to shrink them. So if you don't want to have a 6 foot Joe Pye, they might have a dwarf version that only gets 2 or 3 feet. So other features. So there's been a lot of research and ongoing research still on really what do nativars provide as far as like how do they compare when you compare them with the straight species. And there's a few things that have come out of that research. One is if you're picking a nativar and it has a darker leaf, it's really not as attractive. Same with the variegated leaf. Variegated leaves actually has less nutrition for wildlife versus if you went with just the straight leaf type. So really trying to get darker leaves or variegated leaves and you're hoping to attract wildlife, you're not providing any benefits. It's more aesthetic just for you. Stay away from double flower heads, and that goes for really any type of flower, whether it's a rose, whether it's a zinnia, whether it's a cone flower, because when you start adding in the extra petals, it makes it impossible for insects to actually gather nectar and pollen. So it's entirely just aesthetic for you, and it's of no food value to them. So try to go with things that aren't all the doubled up, but more of this, the traditional looking, the old style roses, if you want to plant some roses in your yard as well. Definitely don't even think about, I've seen this in garden catalogs where they have pollen-free sunflowers. I don't see why you would want a pollen-free sunflower unless you just want to put it in a vase. But stay away from pollenless or sterile varieties that don't produce any kind of seed or a nut, because they're completely removing any source of food for wildlife. They did find that if the cultivation was to actually increase the fruit size, made them more appealing to wildlife, and that changes in things like if it grows compact now or versus more upright or dwarf size didn't really seem to impact how it was viewed to our native species and cause any changes on that one. So the only big one that I will say is that when they cultivate a native, it's through cloning, and so overall it's going to lower that genetic diversity. So I would say if you can, try as much as possible to stick to a straight native species. There's 1 or 2 nativars because you want something that maybe grows a more upright for a corner area or is a little more compact. if you're providing other options, it's not going to provide, it's not going to cause too much of an issue for that one. But if all you went with was nativars, then, you're really you're having a beautiful garden that you can say is native, but it's not going to have the same impact and the same benefits to it. So, and if you're not sure what a nativar is, if you're looking in the garden catalogs or if you're at the garden center and they give it a name, like these coneflowers are called razzmatazz, that means it's a nativar. If it has that little C that it's copyrighted, that means it's a nativar. That means it was a native species that they've done something to it, that they can add a name to it and copyright it and then sell it to you for a lot of money. So, all right, so that is the end of my talk. The last thing I can say before I pull up and start looking at questions here is, as you're growing and planting your native yard, or if you have a native yard and haven't done yet, look into getting your habitat certified through Indiana Wildlife if you happen to live in Indiana, or National Wildlife Federation if you're somewhere else. As far as, where do you go to find these plants? Spring is usually a big plant sale time. So just kind of search, do a Facebook search. Everyone makes Facebook events anymore. But here in Indiana, you can go to Indiana Native Plants, INPS, and they've got lots of information as well as resources on where can you find and buy. A couple of companies that I've personally used both through parks and through my own personal use is Prairie Nursery and Prairie Moon Nursery. And they actually just got a catalog yesterday. So not that I'm promoting one or the other, they're both really good, but the catalogs, their websites, even if you're just trying to get an idea of what's out there, they're beautiful as far as with the pictures and giving you that information. Even their catalogs will tell you if something is deer resistant or if it's good for a pollinator. So even just collecting that information and then hitting a local garden center or a plant sale, it's going to help and benefit you in the long run. So, all right, so let me see. I've got a few here that's popped up. Pull these over. Okay, and if you think of a question, like I said, either throw them in the chat or throw them into the question and answer box, and we will go through these and see if we can get a few answered. So somebody asked, how do you deal with dandelions without using herbicides in an HOA? There's actually a little tool that you can purchase. I don't know what it's called. If someone knows what it's called, drop it into the chat. But you basically dig down and it pops the taproot of the dandelion out of the ground. So you don't need to use any kind of herbicide. You just need to have the time to go around and pop them out of the ground. I actually send my 5-year-old out and let her collect all the flowers, because then it's hard for people to realize that there might be a few dandelions in your yard if they don't have any yellow flowers on them. So I know they're very beneficial for bees, but I have a lot of other things that are growing in my yard at that same time. And dandelions, they pop up left and right. So it's not like she can ever keep up with them, but she enjoys it. So can you recommend a native tree for a front yard that will provide good shade to a west-facing house, but not require a lot of work? Most of your natives, once you get them established, so you'll have to follow the guidelines for how often you water them, but really they don't require a lot of work. The biggest thing I would say for any kind of tree, you're going to want to look at your soil. That's going to be the biggest thing, more than west facing and things of that sort, is what type of soil do you have. You also want to look at how big that tree will get, and how close you have it to your house. I never recommend a clip-out tree very close to a home unless it's something extremely small like a red bud. It's not going to cause the damage with the roots. But so that would be the biggest one, is what kind of soil do you have? Where do you want to site it? How large do you want it to get? The other thing to consider, if it's in the front yard, is, is it going to come in contact with a lot of like salt or other contaminants, because that can also cause some issues with the tree. So those are some things to look at, and then do some research on that one. But yeah, once they get through that time where they're established, most natives don't really require a lot of work because they're supposed to be growing there. If you're looking for something for habitat components to it, an oak is actually, the species oaks are the highest rated as far as for insect habitat. So if you have the room for an oak and it looks like it'd be a good spot, an oak would be always the first one to go towards, but most people don't want oaks in their front yard. It's more of a backyard tree. So a little bit more information, some research, and you should be able to find something. All right. When can I cut off old stems from previous growing season? Is it too early now? After the warm temperatures next week, will it be okay? So usually the kind of the rule of thumb is if it's a continuous week of above 50, then you can clean up and you should be good, because most of those pollinators and other insects have woken up. If you need to do it ahead of that time, if you can create a little brush pile for all of your old stems and kind of leave them there until we get into April or so, that would be the way to go. It's usually what I end up doing, just because I do live in an HOA and I want to make sure that no one's complaining that my yard looks dead where I have my plants. So I normally will cut, I'll try to keep them higher cut for a lot of the plants, because that'll provide some habitat for this year's insects, but then kind of make a brush pile and then wait until we're routinely above 50, and then dispose of or use them as compost, things of that sort. So what should you do with leaves from a tree known to have anthracis? I honestly don't know. That would be a great one to reach out and ask. I mean, I would say if you know of any sort of disease that is any of your plants, then I would just dispose of them in the trash versus into a compost. The same as well as if you have any sort of invasive plant that is growing in your yard, instead of trying to compost that one, also that's one that should be ending up in the trash can as well, keeping your yard clear and clean. So what about habitat for prairie birds like bobwhite alongside the pollinators? Really, the nice thing with the pollinators is if you provide the habitat, the prairie habitat for the pollinators, the birds are going to find it. So a lot of those grass species mixed in with your forbs, with your flowering species, you're going to create basically a prairie or a meadow habitat, and it's going to take some time, but that will start to attract in some of your prairie birds, like your meadowlarks, bobwhites, things of that sort. So, it's kind of the bigger picture. Like I said, a lot of people will garden because they want to attract monarchs. Here here in our parks, our goal isn't just to attract monarchs. We are part of the mayor's monarch pledge. Our goal is to conserve the entire habitat itself, and that includes everything that would be in that habitat, whether it's an insect like a monarch or a bird or a mammal such as a fox, that it's supporting all of those different animals, and that's the goal you should be going for. So again, if things are eating your garden, it's okay. If it's for their natives, that they should be getting nibbled. So all right, any last? We got one here. So if you're within in central Indiana, Hamilton County Master Gardener is having a sale on May 21st. Thanks, Deborah. I know there's a lot of them coming up. I know, Hamilton County Soil and Water has a plant sale going online that you can pick up kits. I've seen Avon Learning Centers having one coming up. There's quite a number here in central Indiana. So yeah, just kind of, if you're trying to look for an upcoming sale, I know up in Lafayette, there's some sales coming up as well. Just do a search on Facebook, and almost everyone makes an event now for their garden sale. And you can kind of see what's in your area, and even if it's just a way to go and to ask questions, or like I said, do a little research and maybe purchase your first 10 plants and give it a shot if you're just starting out. So, all right, what is my time? Well, we are at 2 o'clock, so if there's no other questions, I am going to shut down my chat and my question box. And I want to thank all of you for joining me in this webinar, whether it's in person right now or later on as a recording. Like I said, if you are here in person, I will be sending you a copy of this recording as soon as it's uploaded into my computer. And otherwise, you can always find it on the Zionsville Parks and Recreation YouTube page, and feel free to share it. So thanks everyone for joining me.